and especially thanks to Rod Arroyo. So Rod is here in NFL draft land here in Detroit, and Rod was at the draft yesterday. Are you going to the draft again today, Rod?
No, I think it was a great experience. It was beautiful weather and 275,000 plus people in the core of downtown Detroit, and everyone was just having a great time, fired up, well behaved, and it was a great day for the city. But I don't think I'll be going back. I think I'm good.
Well, it's great. I'm glad you made it, and thanks for taking the time today. So the APA's private practice division has this monthly conversation, typically at 3 o'clock Eastern time on the third Friday of the month, where we can talk about different issues that come up in the private sector. Sometimes it's mentoring or other things. There's some members of the committee or board that are on here today, and we've decided to have some of these conversations just be sort of a facilitated discussion on different topics. And Rod Arroyo is very well known and respected in Michigan and beyond, and was just awarded as a fellow of AICP and received that award in Minneapolis for those of you that were at Minneapolis. And we thought this would be a good time for Rod to kind of share some of his knowledge and experience in the private sector. So this is fairly informal. We've got a few questions, but maybe just a little bit of background on Rod. So Rod is a graduate of Georgia Tech. He's worked at different levels. So he worked for a big national transportation engineering firm. Then he was a partner in a small planning firm in Metro Detroit, where he worked with a lot of communities doing ongoing work and comprehensive plans and zoning ordinances, came up with a clear zoning system, like a user-friendly zoning system before most of the planners have thought about doing that, and did that kind of work in Michigan, but also nationally. He also, then that firm was bought out by Giffords Webster, where Rod just retired from, a mid-size multidisciplinary engineering firm. And so I think Rod can talk about kind of being the partner of a small firm and dealing with his partner retired, and how you go through that. How do you market to a bigger firm, working for a very large firm, national firm? So I think he's got a lot of different experiences. So some of the member issues we get: how do you start a firm? How do you serve as an expert witness? How do you work in the public sector and work also on the side with the private sector and so forth? So I think Rod has a great level of experience that he can share with us. And Rod's won like state awards in Michigan and national awards, very highly respected. And Rod, we really appreciate taking the time today. So maybe we could start out, Rod. You could give probably a better background than I just did on your experience, and maybe start out with kind of what you see as the pros and cons of working for a large engineering firm, starting your own planning firm, and then working for a mid-level engineering firm.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm really honored to have recently been awarded the fellow designation. Really, it's quite breathtaking. And being able to share this information, I'm really pleased to do this. I think the private practice division is a great division, really high quality, and I think you guys are all out there doing good work, and I'm happy to share this information. I just kind of a background. So I guess I'll start from the beginning in terms of why I'm in this field. Maybe it might be helpful. It's kind of an interesting story. So I thought I was going to be a photographer professionally. I've always enjoyed photography. I went to University of South Florida undergraduate. I was on the college newspaper, which was a daily newspaper. I was covering NFL games, concerts, campus events. I was really enjoying it.
And on the call is a professor at that university. So.
Excellent. So I really enjoyed it. But the editor came up to me one day and said, you tend to take a lot of pictures of like buildings and landscape and these places. And, it's kind of odd, most of our photographers are taking a lot of pictures of people. And while you do that, you tend to have this focus. And I started thinking about it, and I was getting a little bit of pressure from my parents. They wanted me to be an attorney. My grandfather was an attorney. He he negotiated the oil rights in Venezuela and had a very successful career. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to try a political science major and see where this goes. And I I was very fortunate that a city planning class was offered at the University of South Florida, and I said, this sounds pretty interesting to me. So I took it, and I really struck gold there because Bob Catlin, fellow, he's been he's passed probably over 20 years now, but he was my instructor, my professor, and he was fantastic, and he always had a smile on his face, always had a great positive story, and he shared what planners really do. He shared the ins and outs, the political challenges, the technical challenges, all of that with this undergraduate class. So I went up to him and I said, I like this. I think I found what I really want to do. How do I become a city planner? And he said to me, well, you need to go get a master's degree and you should go to Georgia Tech. And he used to teach there, by the way. So that was the connection. And he said, if you go there, you'll get a great education and you'll be prepared. And so I applied there as the only school I applied to, and thank God I got in. And yeah, and then I went there and got a great education. And that's where I met my next major mentor, Leon Eplin, former president of the American Planning Association, fellow, also passed away a few years ago. He was legendary. He used to be Atlanta's planning director, started the neighborhood planning unit system. He was the chief planner for the Atlanta Olympic Games. Um, this man was incredible, and his brain worked like nothing I've ever seen before. He was incredibly insightful. He hired me actually for my first job as a planner. I was not quite yet graduated. I was in my final year of graduate school, and I'm so old that when I was in graduate school, there were no cell phones. And Leon was hired by a company that was applying for an FCC license, the very first licenses for cellular communications. And this company decided we're going to bring a planner on board to help us with these applications. So we're working with the RF engineers, and we prepared these applications. We had three communities or regions: Atlanta, Tampa, and Miami. And I learned what it's like to tackle something you've never done before, take a totally different approach, and we were successful. And the small company we worked for became part of Bell South, which now became part of Verizon. And it was an incredible experience, and having that really kind of kicked off my career and taught me that planners can do things. Even if you've never done it before and no one's ever done it, there's a way as a planner that you will likely be able to figure it out and provide value to your client. So that was my first private consulting work. I then moved to Florida and worked for the South Florida Regional Planning Council and became involved with the development regional impact process. Got to work on the Miami Dolphins Stadium, which is now Hard Rock Stadium, when that was first going through the process. Got to work on some really amazing projects there, and then became a consultant when I moved to Michigan in 1986, where I joined Barton Ashman Associates, which is now Parsons. And then Brad kind of told you the rest of the story. I ended up starting my own consulting firm with Dave Birchler in 1989, and then ultimately merged in with Giffords Webster. So that's kind of the short story of my career and the background to why I got into this field a little bit. So maybe that kicks it off, and I'll go back to you, Brad, and tell me which direction you want to go next.
Yeah, I'll ask a few questions, but anybody else that has questions, this is a very small and informal group, so feel free to ask questions or put them in the chat or something. But I guess one thing, Rod, and thanks for covering like why you became a community planner. I saw some of the things on the notice for you that was great. So you've worked for a public sector, you've worked for a very large national private sector firm. You started your own firm and grew that successfully to a pretty renowned firm, and then joined kind of a mid-level multidisciplinary firm as like just leading a small planning group. So what do you see as like, what was your favorite place to work among all those, or what were the pros and cons of those different levels, both public versus private? I guess this is a big complicated question, right? But contrast public versus private, but particularly in a private sector, what was your favorite niche, or what do you see as the pros and cons for those different levels of firm?
Yeah. Yeah, and I really enjoyed them all. They're all different and they all had unique challenges. I'm really glad I was in the public sector for a while, and yeah, and it just so happened that an opportunity in the private sector became available, and that's how I ended up making that switch. It wasn't something I necessarily um, sat down and said, "Boy, I really want to work for the private sector." It's just a good job opportunity came. So the small firm, uh, particularly when Dave and I started our firm, it was really just the two of us and an administrative assistant, and then we slowly grew the firm. And while one of the advantages of that is the decision making process is very short. You know, you have two partners, you just have to get them to agree, and assuming they have the same philosophy, you can get a lot of decisions made quickly. And it's also a lot like working in another family. You know, it's like your family away from your family. You become very close. You get to know everyone. When you have a small number of people that you're working with, you know them well. Whereas when you get into a larger firm, you can't quite necessarily have that same level of knowledge of every single person in the firm. But I found that I enjoyed that. But once we ended up making the switch and joined with Giffords Webster in 2016. Um, I couldn't believe how well that went, and I couldn't believe how much I enjoyed working in a multidisciplinary setting. Because that's the first time I was we had civil engineering, surveying, landscape architecture, GIS services, and we pretty much brought the planning team to the table, and about 100 total employees. And I would say that was it could, what was my favorite? Like I said, I enjoyed them all, but I really wished we had made that type of move earlier, because once it happened, that interaction, and really it's about connecting with the right firm. It's not necessarily, I think it's all people driven and philosophy driven. This was a firm that was run primarily by engineers, but they understood planning, they understood the value of planning, and bringing the planning team on was something they really wanted. And so, in fact, the president of the company, who was an civil engineer, was the chair of the planning board in a nearby community in Birmingham, which is a community that's seen a lot of planning, including two master plans by Andres Rouhani. So you had philosophies that aligned, and you had engineers and surveyors that truly understood the value of planning and um, would listen to the planners when we came up with a different approach. Or one of the issues obviously that comes up is taking on projects, and sometimes as planners we can't take on every job that we may be qualified to take on because of potential conflicts of interest. They understood that. We have a code of ethics. Our AICP code of ethics is not going to be the same as in other professions, and they understood what that was all about. So I think we had that mutual respect, which really helped a lot.
Yeah, I think some members of this group are planners or a small planning group within a larger multidisciplinary or engineering firm, or occasionally architectural firms. And I think the lesson there that Rod shared that I would agree with is, if you're going to join a multidisciplinary firm, you really need to make sure that the leadership of that firm understands planning. You're not just something that, oh, we're going to bring in planning because it's going to be a loss leader for engineering work, or it's more prestigious, but there's always going to be a conflict. You really need, I think, to make sure that there's a lot of understanding of planning and support for planning at the highest levels. And then I think you can be, successful there. And if you're like Rod and I did the same thing, a smaller firm, you have to deal with billable targets and um, cash flow and insurance and everything else that maybe if you're part of a larger firm, you don't have to worry about those things maybe to the same level of degree. So
Yeah, absolutely. Having an administrative staff large enough to handle those insurance issues and payroll issues, and not having to deal with those at an intimate level like you do when it's just a small firm, that was an incredible relief. It enabled me to really do more planning and have more interaction with my clients and my staff. and it freed that whole situation up. And then we had the resources. You're doing a site plan and you've got an engineering challenge that might impact your planning review. You can go talk to the engineer next door and get that input into the process, and or the landscape architect that's 3 desks away. And it really helped us in terms of having those resources right within our firm.
Yeah, so Rod works primarily in Michigan. And in Michigan, a lot of the private sector planners work as ongoing planners for communities. So Rod's firm does that, others firms do that. That's a little bit different for a lot of private sector planners. With our group, some of them work just for a project, comprehensive plan or zoning ordinance or district plan or something, or they work for the private sector. And we've also found, I think, Rod, within APA that some of the professors teaching planning, but also some of the APA leadership has sort of a different opinion of private sector planners than some of us that are in the private sector. Some of us have worked with public and private. So what do you see as kind of what are the myths that you hear from public sector planners about private sector planners or people that are interested in going into the private sector, and they probably have some understanding of the private sector, but maybe they don't really have the full contrast of public versus private. So what do you think are some of the myths that are out there about private sector, that and how do we explain what the private sector does to people in the public sector?
Well, I think one of the myths out there is that the private sector planners are making just boatloads of money, and they're just, their pockets are full of cash and they don't know what to do with it. I've hired a lot of planners over the years. I'm always looking, to fill positions, and quite frankly, some in our area, there are quite a few government planning jobs that I look at those salaries and I say, wow, I could never afford to pay that. And so it's not, obviously not every community is that way, but there are certain communities that pay very well. And for the same experience level, I could not come close. It might be 20 to 30 or $1,000 more than what I could afford to pay for that. So certainly the money issue is I think there is definitely a misconception about that. I think from the financial end of things, the one advantage potentially you could have if your firm is successful and they share profits, which I think many do, including ours all along, you may be in a position to get a bonus where a public sector client likely would not. And so that from a financial standpoint, but from a salary perspective, wow, there's a lot of jobs out there in the public sector that pay very well. So in terms of doing the work, I think it really depends, because there's a lot of public sector planners out there that work long hours. They go to a lot of night meetings. They may be going to a city council meeting, then having to hit 2 planning commission meetings a month. They may be covering the zoning board of appeals, maybe be covering a historic district commission. It could be all over the place. If it's a small community, they may be going to a lot of those meetings, and it may rival what a private sector planner is doing. I think on average, probably private sector planners do go to more evening meetings, particularly if your focus is similar to what we have here in Michigan, where you are the ongoing planning representative for a lot of communities. I have small communities, mid-sized communities, suburban communities, where we go to every planning commission meeting. We're doing all of the development reviews. We're presenting them to the planning commission. Their staff may be there, but their staff is there in a different capacity. It's more like an administrative capacity, and we're actually doing the nuts and bolts work. And then we may also be at the same time working on a comprehensive plan and presenting a chapter of that after we go through the development reviews. So it's different. I mean, and sometimes we're hired in just for a project too. We may just be doing a zoning ordinance, or we may be doing a recreation plan or transportation plan. So it really does vary. So the roles really depend, and it depends on the municipality. When I worked at the South Florida Regional Planning Council, it was run like a private consulting firm. We had to accommodate for our time by project. Everything is the same way in consulting firm. You had to allocate your time. There were budgets for each job. We looked at whether or not we were over budget or under budget. And so that was good training for me to understand me going to the private sector wasn't much of a shock from that perspective. And really sometimes the work is very similar, particularly if you worked for a municipality, for a local government, doing the day-to-day work, and now you're with a private consulting firm that is assisting with that type of work. You may not really see a significant difference in the role you're playing and the type of work you're doing. It's just I like to always act and hopefully get the same mutual respect that we're really part of their team. The consultant is part of the municipal team, and we, in the best scenarios, we are thought of as part of that team and not necessarily as the hired gun always. You're just an extension of our staff. And when we're really slammed, we can use you, and when times are thinner, we'll cut back and we may not use you at all. And that's one of the advantages we always tell them about hiring consultants, is that you have flexibility. If you end up staffing up and then your number of site plans drops, then what are you going to do? Lay all of those people off. Whereas if you use a consultant, you've got more flexibility. So, there's certainly a lot of advantages from that perspective.
And when we surveyed some members before the APA conference in Philadelphia last week, and people that have done both public and private sector, the one thing about the private sector that people were thankful they went back to the public sector was the scrutiny of time management and filling out the timesheet. So sometimes in the public sector, like the place in Florida that you were, probably the leader had been in the private sector, but filling out a budget and having timesheets and everything else. When I started out in the public sector, there is no like time. Oh, if you don't get this done this week, you can work on it next week or next month. There wasn't that scrutiny of time commitment and so forth that I think you have in the private sector, and filling out billable targets. So maybe depending on where you are, that might be, I think, one of the differences. Anybody want to chime in on questions or comments before we go on to another topic? All right. Well, another thing that's come up. Oh, go ahead.
I kind of agree too. So I have both public and private sector experience, and I think my 2.5 years in the public sector has made me a better private sector planner. And I've often said that you work better both ways by understanding how the other side works a little bit. I think one of the big things that I try to talk when I speak, particularly with graduate students about professional practice and the difference in the public sector, is that I have no control of my calendar, particularly in evening meetings. And it has been very challenging for my family now that I'm almost an empty nester here in another 3 weeks. But if city council meets the second Tuesday of the month, then that's when I go to a meeting. And in more rural Midwestern areas, it often means I'm driving an hour or 2 hours to a meeting and then 2 hours home. So that it does definitely have a social impact on you as well.
It does. And I think that work-life balance is one of the biggest challenges to being a consultant, because if you do have the additional night meetings, you're right, you're committed. However, one of the things we always tried to do was maintain a minimum of 2 planners from our firm involved in every single client. And I know it's not the same, let's face it, when you get hired and you're the senior planner, your client wants to see you and not necessarily somebody else. But at the same time, if there's some type of event in your family and you really need to be there, it's a whole lot better when at least that person that shows up at the meeting is knowledgeable of the community, knowledgeable of the projects that they're involved in, and can represent the firm well. And that was always one of my priorities, is to make sure that we had the ability to have that type of flexibility. And the client may not always loved it, but they got competent representation. And I think ultimately they respect you when they realize you do have a personal life. But it's definitely a challenge, and there's no doubt about it. It's the work-life balance is one of our greatest challenges as consultants.
Yeah, one of the questions we've had from some of the members, especially
That
in
guy.
the plain states where there aren't a lot of planners, is how do you charge travel time for? So for me, and it sounds like Jeff, you go to some of these far out places. I know Rod, you did as well, but we always built in travel time. Some firms don't build the travel time, or they bill part of the travel time. Because maybe if you lived in the community, you wouldn't have well much travel time, but if so, then you'd hire somebody maybe locally. But how have you handled, Rod, or others on the call, how have you handled travel time? Because maybe it's different if you're sole proprietor, but you don't want to give your time away. If you have a 2-hour meeting and it takes you an hour and a half each way to go there, you're losing money every time you go to a meeting.
Yeah, and it's hard. A lot of our clients are been very resistant to paying for travel time. And so the solution generally is you have to try to bake it in. And the client, that's where client selection is important. And early on in my career, I did have a lot of smaller clients, and those become very difficult because if they only have one site plan for you to review every month and a small retainer, and they're an hour and a half away, just like you said, it's the numbers really don't work. And so you may have that kind of a client for a while, or have that in your pocket just to have a nice revenue stream. When the economy goes down, you'll likely have the same revenue stream, whether the economy's up or the economy's down, because that's just the kind of client it is. But I found that to be somewhat helpful when the economy turns down, to have some of those core clients that you know are always going to be there and will still have you come out to the meeting just to help to keep the lights on, right? So during the Great Recession, we were very happy to have a number of those clients. But at the same time, you have to find the other ones so that you can bake in that travel time into the fee you charge. That's how we did it. We tried to make sure that when it was a flat fee job, we tried to incorporate that into the flat fee when we did the budgeting. If it was a plan review type situation, we tried to make sure the plan review fee would cover it. You know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You don't win, you don't make money on every job. But you know, hopefully you don't lose money on every single one. You gotta get that balance where you're doing all right.
In my experience, I found that planning for travel one way often is more effective. Essentially a discounted rate, because you're only charging for one way.
Yeah, that's a good compromise, because a lot of a lot of times when you're driving home, it's after work hours anyway.
Oh yeah, it's 11 o'clock at night.
Right. So
Yeah,
Owen,
if
you have a
I can
comment?
add to that, I think one thing is that we're, at least in Florida and many of the other states that I work in, we're working almost in a quasi-legal capacity, sometimes working along with a battery of attorneys. And these attorneys are traveling and they're charging for their travel time. And it's somewhat of a mystery to me that some of my clients, on occasion, or we wouldn't be doing it all the time, certainly, but on occasion are balking at the idea that my billing rate may be comparable to one of their attorneys, while then not balking that they're paying their attorney at an evening meeting who may be there strictly of counsel and not committing or contributing to the conversation at all unless asked a question, but is actually sitting there as a member of the panel. So I think part of this reluctance to charge for travel has something to do with our own sense of our value to the contributions we're making. I mean, that's a personal opinion, but it's one I strongly believe. And I very rarely will go to a meeting where I'm not traveling and charging for that cost. So if that's an outlier view, I at least want it into the conversation to know that some people are doing that.
I like to just add something to your general conversation. I'm going to speak, I think, on the May meeting, and I'm going to talk about the developer's perspective on the planning process. At Hopkins, we had an MS in real estate development. It's in the business school. In some places, it's taught in planning schools, the general context. But what we had to do was come up with a model of the development process, and there are probably a dozen of them around. But we picked one that would look at it from a developer's perspective. And it was created by one of our faculty members, Dan Colehep. The interesting thing about it is that it's the model that they use at NAIOP to teach their courses, their executive courses to real estate developers, and also the CCIM, essentially the brokers in real estate. So one of the, I'll send that out, and it'll sort of lay out the general process and the stages that you go through. The basic underlying concept is value add. The purpose of everybody in the model is to create more value when they're finished with their part of the job than when they started it. Doesn't always work out that way. But one of the things that comes up is that the disparity in pay. You touched on it earlier, but it's quite significant. And in many respects, if I ask one of my developer colleagues about why is there this discrepancy, he'll point out to me that it comes in the bonus. And so the risk reward is where the value, you add the value, you take the risk, and you're going to be compensated for it. But if you look at their model, all the riskiest part and the most value added comes in the what they call the land packaging, which is really done by planners for the most part. So we're adding most of the value to the process to getting the project done, but we're not sharing in the rewards. And not that I have an answer for it, but I think it's something worthy of discussion, and maybe we can come up with some other measure. But that's for next month.
That's good. Yeah, I do want to bring up though a quick observation regarding attorneys and the comment that was made about the travel time with them and the like. I've used the attorney argument in my favor in terms of our going out for bids. A lot of times I'll be working with a client and there's a new project coming out and they say, well, we have to send this out and we have to get bids. And I go, I don't understand that. I'm your planner. Why do you have to go out for bids? And I said, so with your attorney, every time you get a new lawsuit, do you go out for bids and get new attorneys? And they go, well, no. Well, of course, yeah, you have an attorney of record, and they handle your legal work. And until such time as you choose to pick a different firm or hire a new person. And with planning, I think that same argument can be made for a lot of the communities that seem to want to go out for bid for every small project. That use that as a comparison, because we're professional service providers, and really a community should have a lot of similarity in the way they treat those professional service providers. And going out for bid all the time is not productive for anyone. If you don't like the service you're getting from the service provider, get a new service provider, but don't make them go through the RFP process every time a $5,000 or $10,000 project comes along.
Well, in Pennsylvania, in the borough code, there are thresholds for when it has to go out for bid. I can't remember if it's like $10,000 or more. So, everything has to come out $10,000 or less.
Right.
If you want to nail it for yourself.
You break it into small projects that are
Yeah, right.
Well, Rod, you mentioned
in the enabling legislation.
You mentioned in the bio or intro, and it's come up on this call a little bit, that so you've worked in mostly public sector, but you do private sector work occasionally with developers, at least in your career and so forth. And some of the members of this group maybe work for a community, but then they want to make a little extra money, work in the private sector while they're still working in the public sector. And others are trying to figure out, can you work only in the private sector or only in the public sector, or can you balance it and do both? And I know you had mentioned it can be a little bit tricky. You have to avoid conflict and so forth, but can you share some of the lessons you've had when you're working in both the public and private sector at the same time?
Yeah, it's a great question. Earlier on in my career, I sought out work from both the public and the private sector. I wanted to do some work, although most of my work was for the public sector. I wanted to have a small percentage working with developers because, quite frankly, I wanted to learn from that process. And I don't think you're ever really going to truly understand what it's like to come from the developer's perspective if you're not working with them and partnering and in the room having the conversations and going to the meetings and seeing what it's like to be on the other side of the table. And so I feel like I got a lot of value as a planner and actually being able to serve my public sector clients better by having done work for the private sector. I would also share with you that as my career continued to progress towards the last 10 years of my career, I did very little private sector work. I found that it became complicated, particularly when all of a sudden I've got a site plan coming in a community and I've worked for that developer in another community. And so now I've got to disclose it and I've got to deal with that issue. And, you know, my clients have to deal with it and everybody's a little bit uncomfortable. And there were like multiple disclosures that had to be done over a fairly short period of time about 10 years ago. And I said, you know what, it's time to make a change. I've received the information and the knowledge that helps me. And quite frankly, it's kind of another topic, but it really helped me as an expert witness defending municipalities to have worked for developers and municipalities because I could look at these cases, look at a judge or look at a jury in the eye and say, look, here's the observation. I understand why the developer's coming at it from this perspective. I understand why the municipality is doing this. And this is why I think the municipality did the right thing in this case. And I could lay it out. And having that knowledge and having that ability to share those perspectives, I think improved my ability to function as an expert witness. So I guess that's my short answer to all that.
And I don't know if anybody on the call here or meeting is an expert witness. I know it's come up in the past, and I think, Rod, you probably did public and private sector expert witnessing, and then more on the public side or working for the insurance companies. Does anybody have any questions? If you're interested in being an expert witness, any questions on that? I found expert witnessing is very draining. I mean, you have to be really prepared. Some private sector firms have asked us on some of these calls, should you charge a higher rate for private sector or expert witnesses? And I would say it's going to drain a lot of your energy out. It's very time consuming. You got to be really prepared. And I think it's justified to do it if you can do it. But any questions for expert witnessing from anybody on the call?
Well, I do a lot of expert witnessing, especially zoning hearing boards. And one of the big issues, you have no idea how many meetings you're going to end up going to. So you need to be able to bill essentially either hourly on a per meeting basis or something, so you don't end up with no money. And it is time consuming. There's only, if you don't count Friday, there's only 4 nights in the week. So your schedule is dictated by when your clients have their meetings and how often and so forth.
When I'm an expert witness, I charge an hourly rate, and I charge for every hour, and I charge for travel, and I charge for all my expenses, and I charge a higher hourly rate. And yes, it's draining. And I guess my advice to anyone who hasn't been one, who's thinking about becoming an expert witness, if you have an opportunity to try it and you really think you're going to love it, then try it, because you won't really know. If you feel like you have the expertise and you've worked long enough and you're comfortable, give it a try. I found that I really liked it. It's draining. It can be unpredictable. This part I didn't like, because sometimes a trial's going to start or depositions coming in. You had other plans. You have a project deadline that's coming, and you really were planning on spending that week doing something different. So that's the thing that really is probably the most challenging. But I enjoyed the mental sparring with the attorney on the other side, and being in the deposition, trying to anticipate the questions they were going to ask. And I think a lot of times I was able to be successful in predicting it and not getting boxed into a corner. It's really like a mental sparring match. And I think some people love that and some people have no interest in it. And if you find that you go through that process and you got paid fairly well and you felt like you were successful and you enjoyed it, then keep doing it. Otherwise, then don't. But I enjoyed the process most of the time.
If you're in the
Yeah, I think-
Northeast, especially Pennsylvania, New Jersey, where they have home rule, you're dealing with hundreds and thousands of municipalities that each have different zoning ordinances,
That's the
subdivision,
way it
land
is in
development.
Michigan
You got to
too.
remember where you are and which code you have to refer to.
Oh yeah. Well, it takes a lot of time. That's why
It
you
does.
need to be paid hourly and you need to have someone who's willing to pay you the time it takes to get to know the code and get to
Right.
know the case
Because
and
what
do
the
the
other
proper
side of the
research.
street can be a whole different municipality.
Yes.
And my experience is in the public sector planners sometimes are a lot less prepared than you are in the private sector, whether you're working for the municipality, the insurance company, or for the developer. You are paid as an expert and you need to be an expert. You need to know the right code and so forth.
Right.
And I think sometimes the public sector planners are very unprepared for testifying at a deposition or on trial, and they kind of screw up a little bit. And I think the private sector, I think we're much better prepared. So I think that was one of the questions Owen had is, what skills do you have to have as an expert compared to maybe your public sector, the public sector planner that might also be testifying?
You know, in Pennsylvania, where you have county planning commissions, a lot of times that's like a starting point for younger planners. Their first job coming out of school, they get 2 or 3 years of experience, then they may either move to a different municipality or try the private sector. And so you get a lot of people that don't have the experience or skill at testifying and things like that.
So
And
it's
some
not
of-
without irony that I point out we're talking a lot like lawyers now, and it's back to why our rates are worth what we charge, and why we should be in a position to be sufficiently expert in our respective fields to demand and command that kind of money. Although I think Rod did make a point which is important. So while he's now embracing the idea of being the expert witness, he also made it clear that the salaries are not necessarily that much higher. So I consider myself to be well paid at my firm, and there are many, many, many public positions that I think do comparable work that make far more money, and yet we still have these sort of issues about whether we are or we're not experts in our respective field and how we charge for them. And again, I think I'm an outlier, but I feel embrace, charge what you're worth, bill for your travel, bill for your time, because you do have that expertise. And hopefully, if you're in the private sector, you can distinguish with a specific skill set that allows you to advise, to bring value, like Mike was talking about, because you have a unique point of view on a problem, and to advance your client's interest if it's appropriate to do so.
That's good. Those are good points. And some of the skills, though, getting back to the question you had, Brad, about skills, some of the skills are kind of nuanced in terms of what's besides planning skills. There's technique that I think is important. Like one of the things that when I gave my first deposition, the attorney gave me really great advice, and he said, number one, when they ask you a question, count in your head at least 1 to 1,000, go 1,000, give yourself at least a full long second or maybe 2 seconds before you start answering. Because what they typically try to do when they're questioning you, these attorneys, they try to get you upset, they try to agitate you, and they want you to rapid fire back at them, and that's when you make mistakes. So that was number one lesson taught to me from a skill perspective. It may seem like a minor thing, but it's probably one of the most important things, I think, is to take your time, answer the question at your pace, and don't let them interrupt you when you're continuing to give your answer. I would give long answers, and I would have a little pause, and they would try to jump in, and I'd say, I'm still answering, because you have the right to continue to answer. And so those are things that I think are really important. The other thing, when I would prepare a report for most of the cases, I was an expert witness. And then I would try to prepare exhibits that had key points in the report that could then just be enlarged to be exhibits in the courtroom. And I found that to be helpful too. It's one of those things, nobody really taught me that, but all of a sudden, here's my report. And when it comes time for trial, I'm not spending a lot of extra time preparing exhibits because I already have exhibits that you can pull right out of the report and enlarge them and use them in court. So those are just some minor things that were very helpful to me.
One thing too is you want to be careful that you don't try and start your answer before they're done asking the questions. A lot of lawyers will draw the question out and you jump when it's halfway done.
Exactly. Excellent point.
Yeah, I think it's also good if they have a really long, complicated question, say, I didn't understand your question. Can
Exactly.
you
You
restate it
gotta
in smaller
set the
questions?
pace.
Yeah,
Set the pace.
Try to take it over. Yeah.
Mhm. And we
Yeah,
have
you can
one
always say I
talking
didn't
about
understand.
talking about fees in general, where I am in the Northeast, we have so many planning schools in the Philadelphia area and New Jersey and stuff. That's very private sector planning is very competitive. And we all know each other for the most part. So you've got to figure out how can I market myself in a particular niche? Because every time something comes up, there's always the same group that's fighting over the contracts and stuff. So it's like supply and demand. Some parts of the country, there are very few planners. And plus around here, everybody, even the engineers tend to call themselves planners, which doesn't always work, but
yeah, we have similar situation here.
Yeah, a lot of architects or engineering firms say planners, but there's no planners that work there, but that's their motto is we offer planning.
I was vice president of a very large firm that in Center City, Philadelphia, worked all over the country for 25 years. And they're all claiming they're planners and stuff. And they weren't. I was the planner. I was vice president of planning.
Well, thanks, Rod. This is a really good overview. Any other questions from anyone? Last couple of minutes, any questions for Rod or any other comments?
I think these conversations are great. It's really good to get together with everyone.
Great. Well, thanks, Stephen, for joining. All right. All
right.
Well, thanks everyone
Brad,
for joining. Go ahead, Roger. Yep.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to congratulate Rod for his achievement as a fellow. And you probably have heard the news that only about 30% of those who applied were accepted this time. So he set the bar for private practice division. Thank you. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've worked with Rod off and on and sometimes on the same projects and so forth, and he's really held in high esteem. It's a great honor bestowed upon Rod, and he certainly earned it. And so congratulations, Rod, on behalf of all of us and people in Michigan. We're glad that you've been a planner in Michigan instead of staying in Florida or Georgia. So
yeah,
and you helped raise the rate. I could charge a higher rate because Rod set the bar for higher rates too.
There you go.
Some planners in Michigan, some planners in Michigan bid the fees out really, really low. But I could say, hey, Rod Arroyo charges this amount, so I'm charging the same amount as Rod. So.
Anything I can do to help you out, Brad.
There you go, Rod. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Have a great weekend. I'm going to go enjoy the NFL draft. And if you haven't been to Detroit, come to Detroit. It's a fabulous place to be now. We're very excited here for the draft. So
APA conference will be here in 2 years.
So come for that. Oh, and one thing. So Rod was a photographer. So there was a session at the planning conference and Rod was showing pictures of all these great churches from his trips to Europe. And I thought, these are great photos. You could tell he's used photos in his planning work. And these photos were magnificent. But I thought, why is he showing all these photos from Europe? And at the end, he said, all these photos are from churches in Detroit. They weren't from Europe.
Also, there's the emails are flying around from APA. You can do the virtual conference if you weren't able to go there.
That's
it's
true.
all online starting in, I think, 12 days or something. There's a charge and stuff. It's not as much as going to the full conference, but it's a good option.
Yeah, great. All right. Well, thanks again for joining, and hopefully we'll see most of you back next month. It sounds like Mike, you'll be the speaker for that one. Do you want,
Great. Thank you.
Want to give us, Mike, a quick 1-minute preview of what you're going to cover next month? Whoop. Unmute yourself, Mike, if you can. All right. Well, we'll have to join a month from now to see what Mike's talking about. All right. Everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you, Brad.